Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome back. Welcome if you're joining us for the first time. I'll be hosting, I'm Andrea, and I work at Autistica, and I will be hosting this session this afternoon on underserved groups. We know that the autistic population is diverse in makeup and background, but this is often not reflected within the autism research field. Many groups need greater involvement if their experiences, challenges, and support needs are to be better understood. This session aims to provide a platform for work with a focus on people who have historically been underserved by research and whose perspectives and experiences require more attention. All of our speakers will be joining the Q&A session once the presentations have finished. So now we'll go into our first speaker's presentations. Our first speaker is Fang Liu, and she will be talking about using music-assisted programs to improve spoken language in autistic children. So without further ado, here we go.
Good afternoon. I'm really happy to be here to present our study on using music to improve spoken language in autistic children. Our study was funded by the European Research Council Proof of Concept Grant Scheme with me as a principal investigator. There are 3 co-investigators with expertise in language and communication, special educational needs in autism, as well as randomized controlled trials and interventions. And our trial was implemented by 2 speech and language therapists. So the rationale behind our study is that around a third of autistic children do not develop functional speech, having no or few words, even after years of speech, language, and educational interventions. In the literature, a wide range of interventions have been developed for improving communication in autism, but none have proved effective in eliciting functional language in those children. Therefore, researching which interventions are effective in the development of communication or language skills in autism has been ranked as top 2 priority by the James Lind Alliance priority setting partnerships. Unlike language processing, music processing skills can be enhanced or at least intact for many autistic individuals. Neuroimaging studies suggest that language problems in autism are related to reduced connectivity along the left frontotemporal pathway. However, when listening to song stimuli, the kids can actually show intact brain patterns as compared to the neurotypical kids when they were presented with sound stimuli. So our MAP study set out to examine whether we could use music to attract the attention of autistic children to speech. So in 2019, we got the grant from the ERC aiming to run a randomized controlled feasibility trial with 30 2 to 5-year-old autistic children with no or few words as participants, with the goal of teaching them to learn 36 target words. The children were assigned randomly to one of the 2 groups, MAP, in which a structured training method was delivered through naturalistic interactive activities using songs to teach the target words to them, and TAO, treatment as usual, in which speech and language therapy sessions were given, focusing on social communication strategies with focused stimulation of the target words. So both groups of children underwent 36 sessions in total, each lasting about 45 minutes, twice a week for 18 weeks. And we collected their assessments of their language and communication skills at 4 time points, pre, mid, post-intervention, and the 3 months follow-up. So here's an example of the songs we used for the MAP group. And so this song was composed and sung by Georgia Aslett, an undergraduate research placement student on the project. So this song is called the Food Song. You can hear what it sounds like.
Would you like some food? Yes or no? Would you like some drink? Yes or no?
It has food, drink, yes or no as target words in the song. Following the consolidated standards of reporting trials, or CONSORT in short, this flow diagram shows the progress of our trial through 4 phases, including enrollment, allocation, follow-up, and analysis. In total, 91 families expressed interest, among whom 64 were excluded due to various reasons, and 27 were randomized. And we used the minimization randomization in order to prevent selection bias and in order to minimize the imbalance in prognostic factors of the participants across the 2 treatment groups, including gender, developmental stage, and the presence or absence of echolalia, which is meaningless repetition of another spoken words. And in the end, 13 were randomized to the MAP group and 14 to the TAU group. In the analysis phase, because of the participant attrition and withdrawal, we included 11 and 8 in each group. And this table shows the schedule of data collection with 4 time points, baseline, mid, and post-intervention, as well as 3 months follow-up. We collected a range of outcome measures, including the production and understanding of the 36 target words, expressive and receptive vocabulary, adaptive behavior, social responsiveness, language and communication, as well as the number of participants retained at each time points. Due to COVID-19, the intervention was carried out by parents or carers at home through play sessions while being coached online by our speech and language therapist. So the children and parents also did 10 minutes homework every day, practicing the strategies they learned during the sessions, including focused stimulation, intensive interaction, and communication temptations. And the speech and language therapist reviewed the homework videos with the parents in the following week. And the parents from the MAP group also were given an app which contains 11 songs featuring the 36 target words with pictures. And the map was developed by Ruan Renshaw, also an undergraduate research placement on the project. So moving on to the reporting of our outcome measures, according to the consolidated standards of reporting trials, which was designed to improve the transparency and the quality of the reporting of randomized trials, the reporting of feasibility trials should focus on descriptive statistics and estimation using confidence intervals rather than through formal hypothesis testing, mainly because these studies are not sufficiently powered to estimate the efficacy of the treatment due to a small sample size. So in the following, I will only present some figures showing the general patterns of the results without providing any statistical tests. So this figure shows the box plots of the adaptive behavior composite scores of the 2 groups across 3 time points, pre-intervention, post-intervention, and 3 months follow-up, with the light gray box indicating the MAP group and the darker gray box indicating the TAU group. So this is a measure about how individuals function in everyday life, which is also a proxy for IQ. So each of the boxes shows the minimum, the maximum, and the median, as well as the 25% quartile and the 75% quartile in the data set. As you can see, the scores of the two groups were similar across the 3 time points, which indicates that their adaptive behavior did not change much across the 3 time points for either group. And regarding social responsiveness, this is a measure of social ability. So the smaller the value, the better the social ability. So across the 3 time points, you can see that the social responsiveness of the MAP group, the light boxes here, actually improved because their value decreased. It's a beta sign. So for the MAP group, social responsiveness improved. For the tau group, the value didn't change much over time. Yeah, that's the social responsiveness. So these 2 figures shows you language comprehension by the 2 groups as measured by the MacArthur-Bates Cumulative Development Inventories. And across the 4 time points, this time we include the mid-intervention time points, both groups, the number of phrases increased for both the MAP and the tau group. Similarly, the number of words understood by the children also improved over time for both groups. And finally, this figure shows you the number of words produced by the 2 groups. Again, over time, both groups increased in the number of words produced based on their parents' report. So to conclude, by taking part in our trial, children from both groups seem to show improvement in language comprehension and production, although their adaptive behavior didn't change much over time. And particularly for the MAP group, their social responsiveness seems to have increased by taking part. And we have received some wonderful feedback from the MAP parents. One parent said, G is doing so well. He's building some really good relationships with his teachers, continues to sing lots, and now singing the ABC. We're so pleased with him. And another parent said, J still remembers all the songs, attempts to sing the words. So that's our research, and thank you for your time and your interest in our research. I will now hand over to the chair of the session. Please save your questions for later. I will gladly answer any of them during the live Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fang, for this lovely presentation. It was great to see how you adapted it through COVID-19 and the responses that you've gotten from the children that participated. So we'll now move on to the presentation from Jane Waite and Jessica Mingings. It's on the development of anxiety assessment measures for autistic individuals who speak few or no words. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Dr. Jane Waite and I'm a senior lecturer at Aston University, and it's a pleasure to be here presenting today with Jess Mingings, who is a PhD student within our lab. We're part of the COMRAD network for neurodevelopmental disorders, and today we're going to be focusing on a piece of research that we've been conducting on the development of an anxiety assessment measure for autistic individuals who speak few or no words. So why is this important? Well, we know that the lifetime prevalence of anxiety is very high in autistic individuals, and that it's associated with a broad range of adverse outcomes, including self-injurious behavior, depression, parental stress, and decreased quality of life. However, there are very few assessment measures that have been developed for autistic people to detect anxiety. And this situation is even worse for individuals who speak few or no words. Added to this, there are some problems with existing measures that are often used, including the fact that they don't ask about autism-specific anxiety signs, such as changes in repetitive behaviour or increases in behaviours that challenge. And they often require verbal ability to complete. So, for example, if a person has a severe to profound intellectual disability or uses few or no words, these measures will not be appropriate. Finally, there is an issue with diagnostic overshadowing. So what I mean here is that if a measure asks about distress, this might not actually be picking up anxiety. It could be picking up other things that we know are associated with being an autistic person who has few or no words, such as health-related problems and pain. And therefore, many of these tools might not actually be measuring what we think they're measuring. So the aim was to develop a new clinical assessment tool to detect anxiety, but we also included some items that were focused on low mood due to the comorbidity of low mood and anxiety. And we also included some items about pain because of our interest in that differential diagnosis process. And we wanted to then investigate the psychometric properties of this new measure. So was it appropriate for use with people who speak few or no words? So how did we develop the measure? Well, we did it through a broad range of processes, which are far too many to discuss today in a brief presentation. But essentially, there was a literature review stage where we looked at existing behavioural indicators of anxiety, low mood and pain. We reviewed anxiety assessments that are currently in circulation and pulled items from those assessments, which then went into an item bank and then were developed further for our assessment tool. We also interviewed 9 clinicians and 21 parents of autistic people who speak few or no words. And the purpose of these interviews was to pick up on any anxiety signs that we might not have come across as part of our other processes, so that they could be incorporated into the potential item bank for this new measure. And a lot of those interviews confirmed what we already thought regarding the importance of things such as changes in repetitive behaviour maybe being an indicator of anxiety. So this resulted in a 70-item scale, and the items on the scale ask about the frequency of behaviours associated with anxiety, although we don't call it anxiety on the scale, we just ask about behaviours because we still, at this stage, are uncertain whether these items are measuring anxiety, whether they're measuring low mood, pain or something else. And these items then scored on a 7-point scale from almost never to more than once a day. Here are a couple of examples of the items. So we have one item that focuses on avoidance, question 20, and question 38 focuses on having the same daily routine. Now, importantly, there are part Bs to these questions as well, where we ask about whether this is a change from what is typical for that individual. And this is really important because that might be what helps us differentiate anxiety signs from autism characteristics. Our part B questions are currently being analysed, so we're not going to talk about them in detail today, but they are on the horizon and will be incorporated into the analysis. We then named this measure. This is called the CLASP ID, and we sent this measure out into the world, and we got 311 parents and carers to complete the questionnaire. And this was done by recruiting these individuals from NHS trusts, mailing lists, syndrome support groups. And alongside the newly developed measure, the CLASP, they also completed the ADAMS, which is a measure of anxiety, depression and mood for people with moderate to mild intellectual disability, and the Wessex questionnaire, which is a measure of adaptive ability.
So I'm going to now talk you through some of the analysis we've done so far. At the moment, this is all quite preliminary, but we started with an exploratory factor analysis, and for that we used principal axis factoring and applied a pro-max rotation. And then we had test-retest reliability data from 78 participants and inter-rater reliability data from 20 participants. And we looked at both of those using Spearman's correlations. We then correlated the CLASP scores against the ADAMS generalised anxiety subscale scores to look at the convergent validity. And we conducted t-tests to see if our clinically anxious group would score higher on the CLASP than our non-clinically anxious group. In terms of the participants, 61% were male, and they ranged in age from 4 to 83. The mean age was 22. 49% of our sample were autistic, and then there were a range of genetic syndromes associated with autism reported in our sample as well. So that included 15% with Angelman syndrome, 8% with Fragile X syndrome, and 7% with Cornelia de Lange syndrome. It's worth noting that in people with the highest support needs who speak few or no words, it's quite common for them to have a genetic syndrome of some description, and these were just the most commonly reported, so there were a lot of other syndromes in our sample as well. So in terms of psychiatric disorders, the most commonly reported was an anxiety disorder. 22% of our sample had a diagnosis of that. And then in terms of ability level, we looked at that using the Wessex questionnaire, and most of our sample spoke odd words only. They were partly able in terms of their self-help ability, so they required some help with things like feeding themselves and dressing themselves, and they're fully mobile. The factor analysis initially extracted 17 factors, but the bulk of the variance was explained by the first factor, so 26%. And then the second factor explained 4%, and the third and fourth factors explained 3% of the variance each. And based on the scree plot and how the different items were loading to the different factors, we decided to keep a 4-factor solution. So we retained any items which loaded above 0.4 to any of those factors, and we removed one item that had a dual loadings. And what that left us with was a 21 item distress avoidance kind of subscale, which is what we think is at the heart of anxiety in this group. So some example items include things like appearing on edge, running or hiding from objects or situations, and the family being unable to do things they used to do because of emotional distress. Then there are 13 items that look like they're measuring pain. So for example, having jerky movements or grinding teeth. 9 items that look like they're measuring low mood or possibly no energy. So for example, appearing quiet or less active, losing interest in activities that they used to enjoy. And then 4 items that look like they're measuring consolability. So for example, when distressed, I am able to calm or comfort the person I care for. At the moment, all of these subscales are quite loosely defined, and we need to do a bit more work to pin down not only what we think each subscale is measuring, but also having a look at the psychometric properties of the individual items and deciding which ones are definitely going to remain in those scales. In terms of the reliability, so the test-retest reliability at item level was good. All the Spearman's correlations were above 0.38, 98% were above 0.4, and 71% were above 0.6. The inter-rater reliability, however, for some of the items was quite poor, although 67% were above 0.4. It's worth noting that our sample size for the inter-rater reliability was very small, and we know that our sample is always going to have high variability. And that's because different people are going to observe this person in different contexts where we might expect them to behave differently. The other thing worth noting is that we do expect some of our items to have poor inter-rater reliability. So for example, the -0.071 that you can see there was for the item, when distressed, I am able to calm or comfort the person I care for. And we would expect that to be rated higher by a primary caregiver than a second rater. And we might also see that this improves at scale level and once we've removed some of the items from the individual scales. In terms of the validity, so the distress avoidance scale had good convergent validity with the Adams generalized anxiety subscale correlating at 0.75. And people with a diagnosis of an anxiety disorder did score significantly higher on the distress avoidance scale than our non-anxious group. There was also evidence for excellent internal consistency. So the Cronbach's alpha of the distress avoidance scale was 0.90. In terms of some limitations, I've already spoken a bit about the small sample size for the inter-rater reliability. We need to do a lot more work, not only pinning down those individual subscales, but once we've done that, we want to replicate this in a new sample so that we can do things like confirmatory factor analysis as well. So the Beyond study is going to be launching soon. That's a large-scale questionnaire study that's going to be taking place across the entire Cerebra network, and the clasp is going to be included in that. So hopefully we can get the data we need to start addressing that. We also didn't have any direct assessments of anxiety. We are reliant on parent report. However, again, as part of my PhD, I am going to be conducting some direct assessments of anxiety and using the clasp. So again, hopefully we can start to address that. So in terms of future work, as I say, we need to continue what we're doing so far, pinning down subscales, but also defining the clinical cutoffs. We would then like to continue validating again in even larger samples, so through the Beyond study, and eventually we would also like to pilot in clinical services. So to sum it up, we've established that there's a need for a new anxiety measure suitable for autistic people who speak few or no words, and the initial psychometric properties of the clasp do look promising. In future work, we're going to look to replicate in new samples and eventually pilot in clinical settings. So thank you so much for listening, and thank you of course to all of our participants who took part. I'm going to hand you back over to the chair now. If you could note down any questions you've got, we'll be more than happy to answer them in the live Q&A portion coming up later on.
Thank you, Jane and Jessica, for sharing this work with us. It's definitely interesting to see the results of the indicators of anxiety that you've measured and the different measures that you also analyzed. Lovely to hear about your future plans for this as well. So we'll now move on to some of the work carried out by the team at City University. This is Nalini Edwards, Sarah Donald, and Sebastian Geig. It's on the Complex Needs Research and Development project, which is COMRAD. This project is also related to the insights from our study group on complex needs. So please enjoy.
Hello, my name is Sarah Donald, and I'm a PhD researcher at City University. I'm going to talk to you about the Complex Needs Research and Development project. The project is funded by Autistica and is a collaboration between researchers from City University and Cray at University College London. The principal investigators are Dr. Sebastian Geig from City University and Dr. Anna Remington from Cray. Also working on the project is Nalini Edwards, a fellow PhD researcher at City. The aim of the project is to make autism research more inclusive and representative of autistic people who have complex support needs. I'm going to outline a few background statistics to illustrate why we need adaptive research approaches to meet the needs of autistic people with complex needs. Research suggests that approximately 40 to 50% of autistic people have intellectual disabilities. In addition, 30% remain minimally verbal, using few or no words to communicate. However, this significant proportion of the autistic population is underrepresented in research, with only 6% of research participants described as having intellectual disability and only 2% described as minimally verbal. Our research project aims to examine the research process itself to see how we can make it more inclusive and accessible for a wider range of autistic people. For changes like this to be meaningful and successful, they need to be co-designed and co-developed by all of the people involved in the process. To achieve this, we're working with children, parents, teachers, health professionals, and researchers to put research under the microscope and to see if we can find different ways of doing things. The starting point for us as researchers was to explore what methodological adaptations and approaches were already being used in the literature. We found wide variety in the terminology and approaches used to describe autistic people and operationalize key concepts. There isn't time to discuss all our findings here, but we have 2 posters as part of this festival if you're interested in finding out more. The co-design approach we're using is called experience-based co-design, and it has its roots in the NHS, where it's been used extensively as a method of improving service delivery with patients. The approach brings researchers and participants together as equal partners and works in a cyclical way, as I'll explain over the next couple of slides. Previous stakeholder research has highlighted that the community would like to see more research into supporting language and communication and improving mental health, so we're taking this as the starting point of our research. We are working across 3 different special schools with 30 families, trying to identify areas of strength and weakness in terms of communication and to understand their experiences of distress. This involves spending extended periods of time embedded in classrooms, getting to know the children and understand their needs and how they communicate. We're also conducting some adapted versions of frequently used language assessments with the children. During these sessions, we're encouraging children to wear heart rate monitors to help us understand potential distress. And we're also filming the sessions so we can share them with our co-researchers to get their insights. We then review the recordings of the sessions with teachers and parents and invite them to share their insights into what works well and what we could change to improve the process and the experience for the children. We're capturing the perspective of these different stakeholder groups, parents, teachers and researchers, by filming interviews with them. We then work with the groups to amalgamate this material into a series of touchpoint films which capture the key concerns and priorities of each group. The next stage will be to work with separate stakeholder focus groups, sharing the touchpoint videos and identifying the key priorities for change. Our final co-design meetings will bring the different groups together to agree on a final set of key priorities and actions. We'll then work together to disseminate our recommendations and co-design a new project, drawing on the adaptations and ideas we have developed. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we've learned so far from this process. You may have noticed that the final stages of the project were not particularly detailed in the overview I just gave you. This is deliberate and a feature of co-design to some extent. We don't know exactly what the final project will look like, and that's okay because we're not the only people designing it. Our final outputs will depend on the process we go through with our co-researchers, and at this stage we don't know exactly how this will look. In terms of project design, this has meant that we have to be flexible and open to change. To give you an example, we've worked in a participatory way from the beginning of the project. This is Elise Robinson. She's one of our co-researchers and she works at Queen's Mill School in London. I'm just going to read you her words. Flexibility is key when conducting research with this population of pupils. Teachers, TAs, therapists and parents working and living with these pupils must be consulted in order for it to be successful. Their expertise can provide crucial information needed at various stages of the research. Our school fed back to the COMRAD team regarding the accessibility of the initial letter to go home to families. This led to the creation of a wonderful video which helped break down those communicative barriers. The video allowed us to reach more families, particularly parents who engage with English as a second language or are simply too tired to read a dense letter. I'm going to try and show you the video that Elise is talking about now. Hi, are you interested in helping us with our research? Autistic children who don't speak or have learning difficulties are often left out of research. Researchers find it hard to include them, and this means that we don't know much about their needs or the best ways that we can help them. We're trying to make research more inclusive for these children, and Queen's Mill School have agreed to help us. We'd like to work with your child. This would mean watching them in the classroom so that we could get to know them and understand more about how they think and communicate. We'd like to do some typical testing activities with them. These measure things like understanding and language, and they're the sorts of things that your child might have already done with therapists in the past. During the activities, we'd ask your child to wear a heart rate monitor. This will help us to understand whether they find things stressful. If they don't want to, that's fine. We won't make them do anything that they're not happy with. We would like to film the sessions using a video recorder. This means we can watch them back later and understand what's happening. These videos will not be shared with anybody outside the research team or who is not connected with your child. We'd like to show you and your child's teacher the films and talk to you about what's happening. You know your child best, and we'd like you to help us to understand what works well in these activities and what could be better. We'd also like to interview you about your experiences of taking part in research so that we can find out about what's important to you. We'd love to talk to you more about our project and answer any questions that you might have. If you're interested in helping us or would like to find out more, please speak to Elise Robinson or Caroline Bulmer. If co-production is to be successful, we need to develop a mutually trusting relationship with the people we're working with. To do this, we've used existing networks where we've already built up relationships with people wherever possible. We've also put a great deal of time and effort into spending time embedded in context, getting to know people, and especially trying to build trusting relationships with the children we're working with. This is not a quick stop, drop in and collect data and then leave again type of project. We're spending extended periods of time working with people in the field. We have also had to remain conscious of how power is located within research relationships. This involves constant reflexivity and willingness to let go of the process to some degree and collaborate to meet mutually agreeable aims. It's also important to note that we're paying our co-researchers for their time in recognition of their expertise and the equal role that they play within the research process. We've also had to be open-minded and creative in terms of the methodological approaches we use. In particular, we've tried to incorporate visual methods and work with the strengths, abilities and capacity of our participants and co-researchers. For example, we've produced a touchscreen version of the British Picture Vocabulary Scale that incorporates familiar symbols from children's usual AAC methods, therefore allowing them to understand tasks and communicate their needs when working with us. Again, flexibility is key here, as one approach is unlikely to suit everybody. In this sense, we have a toolbox of different methods that we can adapt and use as necessary with different groups. Thank you for your time and interest in our research. This project is funded by Autistica and is based on a joint application of the Complex Needs Study Group, which consists of researchers and community representatives. I'll now hand over to the chair of this session, who will introduce the next panel presentation. Please save any questions you may have for us about our work until the end of the session, where we'll gladly answer them in live Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for sharing this with us on behalf of the rest of the COMRAD project team. It's certainly fantastic to hear about the inclusiveness of your project and how you've been working to truly co-produce, disseminate, and co-design a new project. It is wonderful to see the mutual reflexivity that you have done this to achieve success. So now we will move on to our final presentation before our Q&A, and this will be by Natali Bozhilova. You can find the title right here, and without last but not least, of course, I'll let you watch it.
Hello, I'm Natali, and I'm going to talk about autistic characteristics in 13 genetic syndromes. I'll start with, is it common for people with genetic syndromes associated with a learning disability to show autistic characteristics? Second, do people with different genetic syndromes show distinct profiles of autistic characteristics? And third, how can detailed descriptions of autistic characteristics in people with genetic syndromes help us identify pathways to support? People with genetic syndromes associated with a learning disability are more likely to show autistic characteristics compared to people without genetic syndromes. However, people with genetic syndromes are also less likely to receive autism-related support and adjustments. To illustrate the relationship between autistic traits and genetic syndromes, I'll present a specific made-up example. Dave is a 16-year-old boy with Down syndrome, and his mum thinks he might have autistic traits as well. He uses few words and repetitive language and has sensory sensitivities. Dave also has a good relationship with his researchers and enjoys visiting their lab. In this study, we aim to provide detailed descriptions of autistic characteristics across genetic syndromes, as we believe that these descriptions can help us develop more personalized autism assessments and support for people with genetic syndromes. Both children and adults who were not on the autism spectrum with one of the 13 different genetic syndromes took part in our research. Each balloon below represents the number of people with genetic syndrome who took part in this study. Most of our participants have either Fragile X or Prader-Willi syndromes, and few of our participants have either Sotos or Phelan-McDermid syndromes. 617 of our participants are females and 965 of our participants are males. The average age is 16.5 years of age, and the age range is 4 to 62 years of age. Each balloon below represents the percentage of people with genetic syndrome who have typical hearing, vision, speech, mobility, and self-help skills. 86 to 80% of our participants have typical hearing and speech. 74 to 71% of our participants have typical vision, self-help skills, and mobility. To understand autistic characteristics, we use the Social Communication Questionnaire, or the SCQ, which asks parents about whether their child shows autistic characteristics. For instance, Dave's researcher might ask, "Does Dave have a best friend?" and his mum could respond, "Yes." Each balloon below represents the number of participants with a genetic syndrome who scored above the cutoff for autism spectrum conditions in comparison to autistic participants without a genetic syndrome. 65 of our participants with genetic syndrome scored above cutoff, and 100% of our autistic participants scored above cutoff. Common statistical procedures didn't provide us with detailed enough information about autistic characteristics in people with genetic syndromes. For this reason, we ran more advanced analysis called supervised machine learning, or SVM. SVM provided us with detailed information because it includes the type of genetic syndrome in the analysis. The squares below show how the machine learning method works. Each dot is someone with a genetic syndrome, and each color represents the genetic groups. Before analysis, all individuals are overlapping, and after the analysis, each group of dots represents all people with the same genetic syndrome. Each balloon below represents the percentage of people with genetic syndrome who are accurately classified in their genetic group. 84 to 80% of our participants with Fragile X and Angelman syndromes are accurately classified in their respective genetic group. By contrast, 7 to 0% of our participants with Smith-Magenis, low tuberosclerosis complex, Sotos, and Phelan-McDermid syndromes were accurately classified in their respective genetic group. Syndromes such as Cornelia de Lange and Down syndrome are somewhat in the middle. To check whether variability and self-help skills affected our results, we added self-help skills scores to our model. Our results remain largely unchanged. We also wanted to check whether individuals who are more likely to be misclassified into other genetic groups would be more likely to be misclassified into the autism spectrum conditions group after adding this group to the model. However, what we observed was that individuals with Fragile X and Prader-Willi syndromes were more likely to be misclassified into the autism spectrum conditions group, and the rest of our results remain relatively unchanged. To illustrate better the variability of autistic characteristics in each of the 13 different genetic syndrome groups, we also generated bar charts. As you can see from the image, autistic individuals have a relatively uniform profile. By contrast, individuals with genetic syndromes had spiky, skyline resembling profiles. Syndrome groups such as Lowe, Smith-Magenis, and Sotos had similar SEQ total scores and similar profiles. Likewise, syndrome groups such as Prader-Willi and Down syndrome had similar SEQ total scores as well as profiles. We therefore concluded that people with genetic syndromes associated with a learning disability such as Fragile X and Angelman syndromes showed a specific set of autistic characteristics. People with genetic syndromes such as Lowe, Smith-Magenis, and Phelan-McDermid syndromes, however, didn't. Nevertheless, most syndrome groups were associated with a specific set of autistic characteristics or syndrome-specific signatures. Our research also shows that there is a high level of diversity in autistic characteristics across people with genetic syndromes, and this diversity is likely to explain the low recognition of autism in these populations. Clinical and educational professionals, as well as researchers, should acknowledge the vast diversity of autistic characteristics in people with genetic syndromes associated with a learning disability and tailor support to their needs. This approach will lead to timely identification of autism in individuals with genetic syndromes and enable provision of personalized support. I would like to specifically thank Dr. Joanna Moss, Professor Chris Oliver, the former Cerebral Center and the current Cerebral Network, the rest of the network leads, my lab, in particular Laura and Jenna for the visuals, and the rest of our funders, the Bailey Thomas Charitable Fund and New Life, and of course, thank you for listening to me.
Hello, everybody. We are now entering the Q&A session of the session. And we have 5 of our presenters here today. So we will start probably with a question for Fang. And this is a comment from one of the members on our audience, and they are saying, your study is very interesting and quite inspiring. And they wonder if you can repeat what the age of the children you worked with was, and also how did you end up choosing that type of music?
Thank you for the question. So we work with children aged between 2 to 5, and we asked the placement to record the songs, and she is a singer-songwriter, and she decided to record some songs with 4/4, the rhythm, and in C major. So that type of music is just conventional, really across different musical genres. People use those kind of music. Actually, you can use different types of music as long as you include some verbal content that attracts children's attention. That would work. So parents in our trial actually always sing nursery rhymes to their children, and children learn from nursery rhymes as well. So any type of music would be really helpful.
Thank you for that. We'll go to a next question that is actually for 4 of you here today. So for Jane and Jessica, and also for Sarah and Seb. So this is, what practical solutions can support autistic people who speak few to no words to express their needs, discomfort, distress, and other emotions or experiences?
I'm happy to jump in on that one first, if that's okay. So I think when people are learning to first identify their emotions and what's happening inside of their body in terms of their internal states, whether that's pain, whether that's anxiety, we go through a period of development where we may show signs of experiencing those difficulties, and externally family members might help us label those feelings and help us identify those feelings. And we build up a representation of what those feelings mean. And this means that I'm in pain, and this means that I'm experiencing anxiety. And we also learn ways to regulate those emotions at those times. For autistic individuals who speak few or no words, it can be very difficult for us to support people initially when we are trying to help people communicate pain or communicate anxiety, because externally we might not recognize necessarily what that individual is experiencing, because we see that there is distress, but we don't know what the causes of that distress are. And also the autistic individual might also have difficulties being able then to label those feelings as well, because of alexithymia, or not being able to recognize different forms of emotional states. So in terms of practical solutions, there are a number of different things that can be done. But firstly, I think we need to be better at identifying in people who speak few or no words what the clear sort of indicators might be for anxiety, might be for pain, and also recognizing individual signatures that those individuals have in terms of their pain signature. So idiosyncratic signatures that one child might have that another child might not have, and being able to recognize that and describe that more clearly initially, so that we can then support people to label or communicate distress. But there are also obviously ways to communicate distress if the person is aware of what they might be experiencing as well. And perhaps Sebastian might have something to add on that from his co-creation work, I suspect.
Thank you, Jane. Seb, you've already been.
Yeah, it's an extremely good question, and it's a very difficult question as well, for all the reasons that Jane already explained. I think what's important to appreciate is that we still actually don't fully understand how anybody understands their own emotions and learns how to communicate them. We're just really starting to begin to understand how this process sort of typically develops, how adults do it, and so on. And one factor that seems to be important is some sort of understanding and recognition of what's happening to our bodies inside. So often this literature crosses over with the literature on interoception, which is how effectively you can label and identify changes in your heart rate or changes in your arousal levels, which can be a sign that you're experiencing an emotion, but it could also be that you're simply, changing your heart rate because you've just run up a flight of stairs or something like that. And so one of the things that we're trying to do in our project is exactly to look at this question of how, for example, do parents and teachers recognize that the children that they support are experiencing distress or might feel certain emotions, and therefore help them label them in the way that Jane just described, and how we can use their insights into thinking about ways in which we can give children themselves tools that they might use to communicate how they feel. So because language is a source of difficulty, imitating labeling emotions is going to be a source of difficulty most likely. So we need to think about other ways in which we can give children tools that they can use to let us know how they're feeling. And schools are actually doing a lot of that already. So things like the zones of regulation and other traffic light system type of tools that try and use colors instead of words to describe different emotional states in some ways. But that's one of the questions we want to be looking at really carefully in our project.
Fantastic. Sarah, Jessica, is there anything you would like to add to this? Would you like me to repeat the question as well?
I think part of the question was about how they express their needs as well as distress. And I think it's important to note that, a lot of autistic people who use few or no words they can communicate their needs. They just do it in an idiosyncratic way. And I think sometimes a big part of that is just respecting some of the ways that they do communicate, knowing that person, having the kind of patience and taking the time to get to know them. I'm probably speaking more as a teacher than a researcher now, but also just having respect for their autonomy and their own agency in what they are trying to say, in whatever the means that they are trying to say it.
Thank you, Sarah. Jessica, is there anything you would like to add?
I think the only other thing really is, obviously we know that a lot of autistic people, and especially autistic people who speak few or no words, are going to have a lot of often co-occurring diagnoses, and taking those into account, genetic syndromes, psychiatric disorders, ADHD, things like that, and kind of considering it all as a whole, and how those behaviors might kind of interact with one another, I think is really important as well.
Thank you for the four of you for very thoroughly answering from your perspective this question. I'll go now to Natali, and I'll give you this question. Do support approaches need to be adapted for autistic people if they have genetic syndromes? i.e., do the genetic syndromes have implications for how services and schools should engage with autistic people?
Sorry, can I have the question one more time?
Yes, of course, yeah. Do support approaches need to be adapted for autistic people if they have genetic syndromes? i.e., do the genetic syndromes have implications for how services and schools should engage with autistic people?
Yes, definitely. And this is why we've carried out that research to show that individuals with genetic syndromes autism manifests and presents in different ways. Therefore, just applying strategies and support, we already know it works on individuals who are autistic but don't have a genetic syndrome, might simply not be effective enough, or might not be effective at all, because the particular needs each individual might have will vary, just because each individual has different needs, but also will vary based on whether they have a genetic syndrome or not, simply because having a genetic syndrome comes along with a whole cohort of different needs, familial circumstances, as well as additional experiences that individuals who are autistic but don't have a genetic syndrome simply may not have that same experience. And what we know from research so currently is based on mostly on autistic individuals who don't have genetic syndromes.
Thank you, Natali. Now we'll go to one final question that is actually for all of you. So I will ask it, and then we'll go maybe in the order of how you presented. So we'll start with Fang, and then we'll go on and on. I'll point out to you, don't worry. I'll read it out now. So how can we make, all of you presented work that is inclusive. So this question is, how can we make research more inclusive to include experiences or feedback of people who speak few to no words? For example, when looking to validate evaluations and measures of anxiety and discomfort. So this is something I guess all of you touched upon. So if you want to share a little bit more from your own words, not the recorded ones for us. So Fang, we'll start with you.
Yeah, that's actually a really great question that researchers need to think about really carefully. Based on my own experience, for our children aged between 2 to 5 who cannot speak, the main measures we can collect regarding the language ability is through language report by parents. So that's how we get data through everyday interactions, their interaction with their parents, and their parents report what they have already learned, what kind of words they have been able to say, what kind of phrases they are able to understand. So that would be probably not very objective. One way for us to get objective assessment is to record their interactions through everyday play sessions, and then through the recordings we code what they have produced. But then again, it only captures 10 minutes of their the particular 10 minutes where we ask parents to do the recording. Yeah, so in terms of our research on language production and the perception, there are standardized measures too that we can try to ask the child to point to a picture and ask, oh, can you understand the picture of a car? But then again, it's hard for the child to do the task. It's a really, really important question. I wish I could have an answer to it, but right now we're still exploring ways of how to be more inclusive and how can we measure children's language ability. Yeah, it's a really hard question. I don't know.
So much for giving us this insight. And now I'll go to Jane and Jessica to get your perspective on it.
So I think from a sort of broader perspective that doing research that is inclusive takes a lot of time. So we need to adapt, and we need to think about the robust sort of research methods that we're currently using in populations that don't have the greatest support needs. But all of these methods will need to be adapted when we're thinking about including the whole range of individual needs of people with autism. I think as researchers, we can be more inclusive by being more open about the time needed and about the resources needed, and really trying to highlight the importance of why we do this research and what the impact is likely to be for such a large proportion of people, to get the infrastructure and support in place to allow us to do those projects in the first place, rather than perhaps kind of rushing to get as much research data as possible for a group of individuals where it may potentially be easier to collect data because those methods are already there. So I think some of it is about obviously the adaptation. Of course, it's all about the adaptations we make, but it's about giving ourselves the space and to be able to do that, and to continually kind of feedback to institutions and to funders why that's so important in the first place, so that we can make those changes.
Thank you, Jane. I was nodding along, and I think a lot of the other participants were too. Jessica, do you want to add a little bit or something there?
Yeah, so I mean, in some of our projects, we have been kind of disseminating findings and stuff back to parents and caregivers as well. And we get a lot of feedback from them that our feedback is helpful and interesting to them. And I think that it kind of just being open throughout the process, including all the way up to the end and the dissemination, is really important to make sure that they feel included throughout and would want to take part in research again, and just kind of being more open about research in general, I think helps it be more inclusive. And yeah.
Can I just chip something in very quickly, but also to get feedback on that feedback process so that we can then adapt, because so it's not just a one-way process of providing feedback report, but actually was that useful, and were we investigating the things that were meaningful?
Yes, brilliant. Thank you. I know that now Sarah and Seb have probably quite a lot to say, and they've already said it in their presentation, but I'll let you guys reply.
I kind of think, for me, it's all about co-production. It's all about who you're working with and involving the people that you're working with from the very beginning in terms of designing the approach and thinking about, are we asking the right questions? Are we taking the right approach? Are we measuring the right things? All of those sorts of things are really important. I think, this is obviously what our project addresses, so I don't want to kind of go over a lot of the presentation, but Seb, I don't know if you want to talk a bit more about the idea behind the COMRAD Hub and what their aims are there.
Yeah, I think just in terms of the inclusivity, I think co-production is, like Sarah just said, is a really useful tool in that sense, because then you are not, as a researcher, not in the position to have to make the decision of how best to do that, because we actually are not necessarily the best people to decide how we can adapt processes to make them as accessible as they should be for everybody concerned. And so I think the COMRAD Hub, the whole idea is to look at how we do research in the broadest possible sense. Like, how do we involve people? How do we do assessments? How do we inform people about the purpose of research and all of that? And in that context, hopefully discover ways in which we can become more inclusive. The other thing I want to just briefly say, though, and we have had lots and lots of conversations about this, because there's a risk, in a sense, if we have a narrow definition of what inclusivity might mean. For example, if it means that particular individuals should be able to contribute ideas to the research process or something like that, there is a risk that by definition that will exclude some people who would find that very difficult, if not impossible. And there are individuals on the autism spectrum or with other neurodiverse conditions who, for whatever reason, would not be able to contribute in some formats to the research process, but they can in other ways contribute, or at least their experiences can be sort of fed into the process. And I think that's something important to bear in mind, that inclusivity needs to be sort of seen as a flexible construct that allows us to include people in various different ways, and that there isn't just a particular sort of very narrow definition of what inclusive science might mean, for example, in terms of co-research. And so in the context of the COMRAD project, we have often thought carefully about how we might give the children that we're working with, for example, who do have who speak few to no words, have severe intellectual disabilities, how we can give them a voice in the process. How can we access their perspective of what's going on? And at the moment, we are trying to sort of discover the best ways of doing that by having conversations, spending a lot of time with them, having lots of conversations with the teachers, the parents that know the children well and much better than we will, to get their perspectives on how we can do that. And I'll be quiet now.
Thank you so much to everybody. I'm still, last but not least, of course, I'd like to hear Natalie's opinion.
I definitely agree that we need the right infrastructure, exactly what Jane has mentioned, and co-production is just absolutely key. But I also wanted to say that a lot of research output can be inaccessible to the people we do it for and for the wider community, because it's simply really hard for people to understand unless they're experts, just the terminology, the way it's written, the format. Often people need specific training, research or clinical training to be able to access it. And I think that's a really key point, how we actually disseminate materials and whether they're accessible to our participants, their families, and everyone who's interested, and whether we can also do things. I know that sounds a lot of work, but whether we can think of alternative ways we can present information that everyone can access and understand and benefit from.
Thank you, and thank you, Natalie. Thanks to everybody here. I think that a lot of what was said today can be extrapolated to further away than just to underserved groups, certainly. So I do hope that you continue a conversation with these marvelous presenters. The team at Autistica are posting their emails and their Twitter handles on the question Q&A system below us, so you can continue the conversation, or if you have anything further to ask. Thank you so much for staying with us. 7 minutes over, but I think it was worth to listen to these perspectives that are much needed within autism research. Thank you for joining the session. To the presenters, we will continue our next session at 2:30, and we'll be glad to see you there. If you don't have a chance to join us, everything will be recorded and they will be on our YouTube soon. Thank you very much. See you later.
Thank you, Andrea. See you.
Bye.